So as I'm walking, one of the things that's really heavily on my mind today, because of some reading I'm doing, I'll just call it, for the sake of our conversation, the paradox of positive thinking. That's what I've decided we're going to call it. I don't know if other people call it that. That's just what it's being called for our purposes here. And it goes like this. Okay, so you suffer a trauma or a loss, and people are immediately like, look on the bright side, or they kind of do the spiritual bypass thing, like, God doesn't give you more than you can handle, it's in God's will, or they do the whole, like, at least this, at least that, at least you lived, at least you had a healthy baby, at least whatever, right? And so the reason I call that toxic positivity is because it's an attempt to bypass the very genuine emotion of anger, grief, loss, disillusionment, rage, sadness, etc. And that bypassing is not good in the long run, because what it really means is that instead of feeling those heavy feelings, we're attempting to skip them. And spoiler alert, we can't skip negative feelings indefinitely. We can do it for a short while, but if we keep doing it, it just sort of accrues interest in the background. It causes physiological issues, it causes stress response, it causes relational difficulties. So it's not really a winning strategy to try to skip the negative emotions. The other thing about it is we sort of have an all or nothing option, which is we either get to feel our feelings, including the highs and the lows, or we detach from all our feelings, right? Through some form of self-medication, dissociation, numbing, etc. And so because of that, if we keep trying to bypass or skip the negative and go straight to the positive, what we end up doing is creating really a crummy quality of life for ourselves long term with a whole bunch of downstream effects. I don't have time for that today. You get the point. It's not good, right? So toxic positivity, bad, right? It's bad. Okay, we're all on the same page on that. But here's the other thing. And that is that we know that positive thinking is incredibly important for quality of life, right? So like, for instance, our expectation of pain going into a procedure impacts how much pain there will actually be, right? Our belief about our body's ability to heal, for instance, directly correlates to how our body heals. This is true in a lot of ways. It can even manifest in actual, measurable, physiological changes. And I know this to be true because I'm trained in an Ericksonian hypnosis, which is just a form of hypnosis used by an important psychologist. But the point is that we know that suggestibility is important, right? If I believe that something is going to help me, it's more likely to help me. If I invest in it, I'm more likely to get something out of it. And if I believe I am capable of healing, then I generally am. This is very annoying for those of us who have spent a long time being invalidated in any suffering we've experienced. We don't want to be told that we can think our way towards anything positive. And here's the other thing. I'll tell you, I have had 2 cancer patients close to me in my family, and the level of people acting like you can think your way out of cancer is shocking. It's very upsetting, right? It's the ultimate victim blaming. There are biophysical realities in this world. No matter how enlightened we are, we're all going to die of something. This is going to be something that gets us in the end. We're not going to think our way into immortality. We're not going to think our way out of old age, right? That said, we can measure that thinking is really important to quality of life, energy levels, relationships, healing, health, etc. So this is the paradox of positive thinking that I often find myself bouncing around in, because there are opportunities after horrible experiences. For instance, this field that is new research field of post-traumatic growth. Well, it's not brand new, but it's gaining a lot of interest lately. That demonstrates that some people, after a horrific trauma, when they go through the other side, they actually end up stronger than before it happened. Not everybody, right? And so they're trying to measure, like, what is that? What's the difference? Why did that happen for some people and not others? That's, again, not something we have time for today, but it's a super interesting field of research. So as a trauma therapist and as somebody who is healing from my own grief because of a recent death in the family, I'm giving a lot of thought to, like, how do we, especially in the mental health profession, not err to either side? In other words, I've had clients come to me who, God, they went to a trauma therapist or a therapist for their trauma, and they were just told, like, look on the bright side, which is so toxic and so ill-informed, right? Because there's a central nervous system component to trauma that until you get help with skillful direction, you're gonna have a really hard time doing much about it. Okay, that's the truth. So it's just kind of ill-informed, but it's also just not nice. Like, if people could just gratitude their way out of trauma, right, they would have done that already. I used to work with combat veterans. These are not people who are weak-minded. These are people who do things that we could not even imagine, right? They could think their way out of it, they would. So that's absolutely, there's a place where that positivity is toxic to the healing process and to the person. At the same time, people can tip into identifying with their diagnosis, identifying with their pain, their trauma, their illness, or whatever, to the point that they are now not experiencing the full benefits that positive thinking could potentially give them. Right? That is so tricky to me as a therapist. As a person in regular life, I think I've got it figured out, because I feel like in regular life, I'm never going to offer people positivity for their suffering. That's not my job. It's their job to decide when it's time to start employing a positive perspective. And I trust them to figure that out. My job as their friend is to empathize, to listen, to be a safe space for them, right? That's my job as their friend. So that's pretty easy there. But you know where it gets hard for me is in a professional role. This is where I'm really curious to hear your feedback on this, because in our attempts to make sure that we are not being toxically positive and we are not invalidating what people are experiencing, which is so important, how do we make sure we don't also create a relationship that's entirely built on a foundation of suffering? Does that make sense? In other words, my care for you is only because you're suffering. My attention towards you is only because you're suffering. At what point do we have a professional responsibility to start to talk about things like post-traumatic growth, strength, resilience? How do we make sure that we are not one more toxic positive voice? Now, in the past, what I would have said and what I've said to my interns is, I think people do that automatically when they have been deeply heard long enough. In other words, I think people resist positivity when they've been shoveled, force-fed a lot of toxic positivity. And when they're given enough true empathy and connection, they sort of naturally evolve as they move through the grieving or the trauma process into wanting that for themselves. And then it's not a thing that, we have to force. They just kind of come in one day ready for it. I think that's true for people who are dealing with single incident trauma. But for people who have had just an unfair shake in early childhood development and therefore really haven't gotten to experience things like resilience and growth being supported by caretakers, I think sometimes they need a nudge. And that's where, as a mental health professional, it bothers me to see people get too much to one extreme or the other. There's a mental health crowd that's all about like manifest your dreams, think positive, be positive, everything's gonna be fine, and that's the entirety of it, right? And then there's the other side of the crowd, which is like, hold empathy for the pain, hold empathy for the pain, hold empathy for the pain, and that's it. And both of those extremes to me have problems, because both of those extremes can lead to a sort of inertia, right? On one side, because they're not actually processing the truth of their experience, and on the other side, because they are, on one side, they're not processing the truth of their experience because they're rushed to the positivity. On the other side, because they're never really given wings to fly with, right? They just stay in that space. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about positivity, about the paradox of positivity. How have you made sense for this in your own life? Have you had experiences with mental health providers that were too much, one or the other, or coaches, or something else that's like too much one or the other? Because I feel like with all things, it's easy to be really loud if you're at one extreme or the other, right? But in between is where like health actually lives. And that I find is more requiring thoughtful contemplation, and perhaps is a different answer for everybody. So let me know what your thoughts are.